They say love blinds you, but in my case, it also gave me a front-row seat to the NFL's most unnecessary roughness. Turns out, the only thing my wife tackled harder than her nursing shifts was her linebacker patient. Funny how you think in sickness and in health includes injured reserve lists. I met Sue the year she graduated from nursing school, fresh-faced and full of dreams. I was fresh out of grad school myself, armed with a PhD in economics and a head full of plans for the future. We were the classic picture of a young couple in love, bright, hopeful, and utterly naive. Her dad, a hotshot heart surgeon with a God complex, hated my guts because I wasn't a real doctor. He insisted on a prenup, and I signed it without a second thought. After all, I wasn't marrying her for the money. For the first few years, things were good. We bought a house with a little help from her dad, had a beautiful daughter, and settled into the rhythm of married life. Sue worked long hours at the hospital, but she loved her job. I loved my job too, teaching undergrads about the wonders of supply and demand, though the latter always seemed more elusive in my own life. Things started to shift after Sue's pregnancy. Once she stopped breastfeeding, she became increasingly self-conscious about her body. I thought she was perfect, but she insisted on getting a breast augmentation. I didn't argue. I just wanted her to be happy. But looking back, I should have questioned the arrangement she had with the plastic surgeon. Something about her grinning like a lottery winner after every post-op appointment and the unmistakable smell of hospital-grade mouthwash lingering on her breath didn't sit right with me. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the quirks of her job. Then came Tyrone the Beast Williams. He was a professional linebacker with a reputation for breaking bones and bending rules. Sue couldn't stop talking about him when he landed on her floor for some routine tests. I didn't care much for football, but even I knew his name. He was big, loud, and everything I wasn't. She gushed about how polite he was, how down-to-earth, how different from the celebrity stereotype. She started working longer hours. She came home later, her stories peppered with anecdotes about Tyrone. At first, I thought it was innocent, just another patient she admired. But admiration has a way of morphing into something darker when you're not paying attention. And one of my students was the first to confirm what I hadn't dared to consider. During an offhand conversation after class, she mentioned seeing Sue up at a lake house, the kind of place we'd never been to as a family. My wife was apparently visiting a friend. That friend just so happened to be Tyrone Williams. I knew then that the cracks in our marriage weren't just stress fractures. They were full-blown fault lines. And somewhere beneath the surface, the ground was ready to shift. After Ann's comment, I couldn't shake the image of Sue at Tyrone's lake house. The vanity plate confirmed it was her car, but the rest was a blur of denial and confusion. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe she was there for something innocent, a favor, a work-related visit. But deep down I knew. People don't tan on a lake house deck with NFL linebackers out of professional courtesy. I started paying closer attention. Little things began to surface, things I'd overlooked or ignored. Her stories about work were vague, sometimes inconsistent. She began keeping her phone on silent and turned face down on the counter, an odd shift for someone who used to leave it lying around without a care. She'd become particular about her appearance, too. New clothes, more makeup, and enthusiasm for the gym that came out of nowhere. I told myself she was just taking care of herself, but I wasn't buying it. One night, she came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly tousled. She claimed she'd stayed late to cover for a colleague. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but I couldn't shake the nagging doubt. It was the same night I decided to check her phone. I waited until she was asleep, her steady breathing filling the silence of our bedroom. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. Her password hadn't changed. Scrolling through her messages, I found nothing at first. Her chats with friends and coworkers seemed harmless enough. Then I noticed a name that stood out. T. The messages were sparse, most of them deleted, but a few remained. See you tomorrow? Same time. My heart pounded. The timestamps lined up with the days she'd claimed to be working late. There was no context, no proof of anything, but the ambiguity made it worse. I kept scrolling, hoping for something, anything, that would exonerate her. Instead, I found a recent photo in her gallery, a view of a lake, the water sparkling under the sun. The kind of photo you take when you're somewhere beautiful and want to remember the moment. Somewhere I'd never been. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, each more damning than the last. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I knew she'd deny it. I needed more than hunches and half-truths. I needed proof. The next day, I called in sick to work and drove up to the address and had mentioned. Tyrone's lake house was as extravagant as you'd imagine. Sprawling, gated, with a private dock. I parked a distance away, my car hidden behind a cluster of trees. Hours passed, and I felt ridiculous, like a stalker in a bad TV drama. But then I saw it. Sue's car pulling into the driveway. I watched as she got out, her movements casual, confident. She was carrying a bag. Overnight, maybe? My stomach churned as she walked up to the door, her knock answered by none other than Tyrone Williams. He greeted her with a grin, the kind of grin that said more than words ever could. They went inside, the door closing behind them, leaving me alone with the weight of what I'd just witnessed. When I drove away from Tyrone's lake house, I didn't feel anger. Not yet. It was something else, something heavier. A mixture of disgust and disbelief, maybe. It was as though someone had taken the script of my life and scrawled over it in red ink, rewriting every scene I thought I understood. But I didn't turn into a one-man surveillance team. That would have been predictable. No, I decided to let the answers come to me. Sue and I had shared years of routines, rituals, and unspoken rhythms. It occurred to me that her betrayal might not be as hidden as I feared. It might be hiding in plain sight. Instead of planting bugs or stalking her social media, I started noticing the things she didn't think I'd notice. Her scent, for instance. It wasn't just perfume. It was the way her skin carried a faint musk when she returned home, one I knew wasn't from our house. The small changes in her nails, subtle, understated but always freshly done. Or the receipts she'd leave crumpled in her car for things she had no reason to buy. Expensive cigars, bottles of whiskey, items I knew she didn't bring home. And then there were the shifts in her speech. Words like team effort, mutual respect, and balancing acts cropped up in her casual chatter about work. I wasn't sure what those words meant in the context of a linebacker, but they didn't sound like medical jargon. Still, I wasn't hunting for evidence. That wasn't the plan. I wanted something bigger than proof. I wanted clarity, something undeniable. Then, like fate had a twisted sense of humor, clarity came knocking. It was late one evening, a rare moment when Sue had gone to bed early. I was working on my lecture notes in the quiet of the living room when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. You deserve to know the truth. Meet me tomorrow. No names, just the truth. It could have been a scam, sure, but something about it felt raw and real, like the kind of text someone sends when guilt starts to eat them alive. For the first time, I felt the faint ember of hope. Not for reconciliation, not for salvaging what Sue and I had, but for answers. The next day, I drove to the address they provided. It wasn't a shady parking lot or an abandoned warehouse, like in some cliché thriller. It was a quiet cafe, tucked away in a part of town I rarely visited. Inside, sitting in a corner booth, was my student. Her face was set with the kind of determination that only comes when someone's wrestling with their own conscience. She didn't speak right away, just gestured for me to sit. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a freight train. You're not the first husband she's done this to. It turns out that Tyrone the Beast Williams had a reputation, but not just for his on-field exploits. Ann's partner had been close friends with another nurse, a woman whose marriage had been wrecked by Tyrone's charm. Sue wasn't just another victim, though. She was a willing accomplice, a regular at these little rendezvous, the name whispered in hushed tones when hospital staff swapped stories. I sat there, sipping my coffee, trying to wrap my head around it all, and didn't mince words, didn't sugarcoat anything. She laid it out plainly. The patterns, the rumors, the other lives Sue had quietly dismantled while I thought we were building ours. By the time it finished, I didn't feel the rage I expected. What I felt was sharper, colder, like the edge of a knife. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't about our daughter or our home or the years I'd spent loving someone who didn't deserve it. It was about setting things right, not through vengeance, but with precision. I thanked and left the cafe and drove straight home. Sue wasn't there, another late shift, or so she claimed. The house was quiet, almost serene. I sat in the dark for a long time, letting the realization sink in. I wasn't going to confront Sue, not yet. That wasn't my style. Instead, I let her walk right into the trap she'd set for herself. After all, if there's one thing I've learned as an economist, it's that every action has a consequence. And Sue was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I don't remember much about the days that followed Anne's revelations. Time seemed to slow, every moment stretching endlessly, but I wasn't idle. My mind was clear for the first time in weeks. The haze of confusion and denial lifted, leaving something sharper in its place, a strange, exhilarating clarity. Sue was methodical, but she wasn't careful. Her patterns were as predictable as a metronome once I saw them for what they were. The gym bag she carried to yoga classes that conveniently aligned with Tyrone's recovery sessions. The text she deleted but couldn't erase from her nervous glances at her phone. She had no idea I'd stopped being the unsuspecting husband and started playing my own game. I began to strip away the foundation of her double life without her even realizing it. Sue had built her charade on the premise that I'd always be there, the solid and unsuspecting husband providing cover for her extracurricular activities. So, I started dismantling the pillars of her comfort. It began with the small things. I canceled the automatic transfers to our joint account. Quietly, subtly. She didn't notice at first, too absorbed in whatever fantasy life she was living. Then I reached out to a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but a specialist in high-conflict divorces. I explained everything. The prenup, the evidence, the names. The lawyer listened with a grim sort of approval, assuring me that with what I was preparing, Sue wouldn't just lose the upper hand. She'd lose the game entirely. But my real stroke of genius came from a lesson I'd learned in economics, the power of leverage. Sue's father, the esteemed Dr. Hart, was the key. He never liked me, always treating me like the interloper in his perfect daughter's life. What he didn't know was that his disdain had kept me observant, careful. Over the years, I'd built a mental dossier on him. The tax discrepancies, the questionable clinic practices, the under-the-table deals. All of it sat in a neat little folder, waiting for the right moment. When I reached out to him, it wasn't to blackmail or threaten. It was to plant a seed. I mentioned casually how Sue had been distant lately, how her work seemed to consume her. I hinted, just enough that there might be another man involved. Watching Dr. Hart's face harden as he realized his perfect daughter wasn't so perfect was more satisfying than I expected. He didn't ask questions, but I knew he'd dig deeper. And when he did, Sue would find herself cornered from every side. The tipping point came on a sunny Thursday afternoon. Sue had left for her usual yoga session, leaving her gym bag conspicuously overstuffed. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I spent those hours preparing the final piece of my plan, a carefully curated package of evidence. It was brutal in its simplicity. Texts, receipts, photos, every piece of her betrayal laid bare. I sent copies to her father, my lawyer, and Tyrone's team manager. I even dropped an anonymous tip to a gossip site, knowing they'd salivate over the scandal of a married nurse cavorting with an NFL star. When Sue came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, calm and composed. She kissed me on the cheek, the same way she always did, and for a moment, I almost faltered. But then I remembered the lake house, the texts, the smirk on Tyrone's face when he opened the door for her. Whatever love I'd felt for her was gone, replaced by something colder. I didn't say a word as she poured herself a glass of wine, humming a tune I didn't recognize. The silence hung between us like a noose, tightening with every passing second. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her smile faltering as she read the message. Her eyes darted to me, wide with panic. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my tone light, almost cheerful. She didn't answer. Her hands shook as she set the phone down, the glass of wine forgotten. I waited, savoring the moment, knowing the walls of her deceit were closing in. Sue didn't know it yet, but she was already out of moves. Sue's panic was almost poetic. I watched her carefully, how her composure slipped, her breathing grew uneven, and her hands fidgeted like they had a mind of their own. She wasn't used to this, being on the back foot. For years, She'd built her little empire of lies, confidently weaving her deceit into the fabric of our marriage. But now, the threads were unraveling faster than she could stitch them back together. She didn't say anything at first, but I saw it all on her face. The realization that the careful mask she'd worn for so long was about to shatter. I didn't have to speak. The silence was my weapon, cutting sharper than any words could. Then her phone buzzed again, and again. Each vibration felt like a nail in the coffin. Her breathing hitched as she picked it up, her trembling hands betraying her. She swiped at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth. A string of messages. I knew what they said without needing to see them. She looked up at me, her face pale and her lips trembling. "What's going on?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned back in my chair, taking a long, deliberate sip of my drink. "You tell me," I said, my tone casual, almost bored. But inside, I was boiling with satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing justice is unfolding exactly as planned. Her phone buzzed again, and she flinched. I imagined the messages were pouring in now, from her father, her colleagues, maybe even Tyrone himself. The package I'd sent was making its rounds, leaving no stone unturned. Every lie she'd told, every secret she'd buried, was rising to the surface like a shipwreck exposed by the tide. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to make a call," she stammered, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. But as she moved toward the hallway, I stood too, blocking her path. "Not so fast," I said, my voice cold. "You've had plenty of time to talk, Sue. Now it's my turn." Her eyes filled with tears, the kind that might have moved me once. But not anymore. I wasn't the man who'd blindly believed her excuses, who'd shrugged off the red flags because he loved her too much to confront the truth. That man was gone, buried under the weight of her betrayal. I laid everything out for her, piece by piece. The texts, the receipts, the photos. The lake house. Tyrone. Her colleagues' whispers. Her father's fury. Each word hit her like a blow, and by the end, she was crumpled on the chair, her face buried in her hands. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking for the first time. "I gave you everything, Sue. And this is what you gave me in return." She didn't respond. What could she say? The truth was laid bare between us, raw and unyielding. There was no room for excuses, no place for denial. She had gambled with our marriage, our family, and she had lost. The final blow came when I handed her an envelope, divorce papers pre-filled and ready for her signature. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face contorted in disbelief. "You already decided," she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question. She knew. I nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "This isn't a decision," I said. "It's the consequence of yours." When Sue finally signed the papers, the sound of the pen scratching against the page felt like a dirge, a low, mournful note marking the death of something that once mattered. She didn't argue, didn't plead. By then, she knew better. There were no words that could rebuild the ruin she'd created. The damage was absolute, and even she seemed to understand that. After she left the room, I stayed at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope. It felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it should have. Not with regret. I had none, but with the weight of finality. 20 years of marriage distilled into a single document, as if all those moments, good and bad, had never existed. It was sobering in a way I hadn't anticipated. The days that followed were strange. The house felt quieter, emptier, but not because she wasn't there. No, it was emptier because I could finally hear my own thoughts without the dull hum of lies in the background. I started noticing things I'd ignored for years. The creak of the floorboards, the way the sunlight hit the kitchen window in the morning, the sound of birds outside. It was as if the world was slowly coming back into focus, sharper and more vivid than it had been in ages. Sue moved out soon after. Her father had cut her off financially, furious about the scandal and how it reflected on his family name. Tyrone? Oh, he didn't fare much better. The gossip site I tipped off ran with the story, and his team quietly placed him on indefinite leave to avoid the PR nightmare. I wondered if Sue had expected him to catch her when she fell, but if she did, she was sorely mistaken. He disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived, leaving her to fend for herself. It wasn't long before mutual friends started reaching out, their calls and messages dripping with faux concern. "Are you okay?" they'd ask, their voices heavy with curiosity masquerading as sympathy. I didn't indulge them. I didn't want their pity or their judgment. I just wanted to be left alone to figure out what came next. Our daughter, Sarah, was the only bright spot in those dark weeks. When I told her what had happened, her face crumpled, but not with surprise. "I always felt like something was off," she admitted quietly. "But I didn't know how to tell you." That broke me in a way Sue's betrayal hadn't. My own child had carried the weight of suspicion, trying to protect me from a truth I didn't want to see. I hugged her tightly, promising her that no matter what, we'd get through this together. And we did. Slowly, life began to take on a new rhythm. I threw myself into my work, finding solace in the predictability of numbers and theories. Sarah and I grew closer, our bond forged in the crucible of shared pain. We laughed more, talked more. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly present, not just going through the motions of a life that had been built on sand. One evening, months after Sue had left, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a glass of whiskey in hand. The air was crisp, the stars scattered across the sky like shards of broken glass. I thought about everything that had happened, all the pain and betrayal, and I felt free. Not happy, not yet, but lighter somehow. The kind of lightness that comes when you've survived something you thought might break you. In the end, Sue's betrayal wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of who I used to be, the man who ignored the warning signs, who gave and gave without asking for anything in return. But it was also the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. And as I sat there, watching the night unfold, I realized that maybe, just maybe, losing her was the best thing that ever happened to me.